Hi, I'm Rhiannon from the Epsom Bakehouse, and today I'll be sharing 5 secrets to baking a perfect brioche loaf or other enriched dough. If you're enjoying these bread making tips and you'd like to hear more from me, you can sign up for my free bread making tips, recipes and more via the link below this video. Today I'll be sharing my top tips for baking a delicious fluffy brioche loaf just like this or other enriched dough. Brioche is light, rich, buttery, slightly sweet, and a delicious treat that you might like to enjoy eating at home. And you also might like to try baking your own. So how can you make sure that you bake a loaf that's just as light and fluffy as this, really well risen and a delicious treat to enjoy? Watch on to find out more. And don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying the tips. First up, I just thought I'd discuss what is an enriched loaf or dough. It's a bread that's made with additions such as eggs, milk, butter, sugar, and these all contribute to making this light, fluffy dough. They don't have to necessarily be really sweet, but they've definitely got some fats in, for example, from the butter or eggs, and that contributes to this light and fluffy texture inside the crumb of the loaf. So how can you make sure you're baking a great brioche loaf? Well, first things first, when you add in additions that enrich your dough, it can slow down your yeast. For example, the butter will coat the flour in your dough, and it will actually slow down how the yeast can access that flour, which is their food, and they want to digest, the yeast want to digest that food and start producing gas to rise your loaf. One thing you can do is slightly increase the amount of yeast that you put into your recipe. Not very much, you don't want to overyeast the dough, but for example, you might be putting in 7 grams of dried yeast into 500 grams of bread flour, rather than 5 grams that you would put in for a dough that's not enriched. Tip number 2 is actually to leave those additions, some of them at least, to last in your dough. So when you start mixing up a dough, and I've just started to demonstrate one here with some flour and water, when you start that process, the flour absorbs the water and gluten begins to form in the mixture. So as that gluten forms, you actually get this stretchy mixture. Your dough becomes very stretchy and elastic as that gluten forms. And you want that to happen. That gluten is going to form the scaffold of your bread. But if you add in lots and lots of butter at this point, that butter, as I mentioned, will coat the flour and actually slow down the rate of the water absorption. So the gluten will form much more slowly and might not even form properly at all if you aren't able to knead and absorb all that water into your flour. You might find that in lots of enriched doughs, especially where there is a lot of fats added, that there's a stage where you add the butter after you've made the main dough. So you get that nice stretchiness in your dough and you develop that gluten before you add in the butter. So have a go at doing that, and so make sure you have good gluten so you get a good rise on your loaf and it will support the bread as it bakes. My third tip is to allow plenty of time for your dough to rise. When you add in yeast to your dough, what it's going to do is start producing gas as it digests the flour, and that gas is going to rise your dough and you'll get a beautiful, well-risen dough that isn't solid or underbaked in the middle. You don't want a solid doughy centre where no gas has been produced and the loaf hasn't risen. To help that process, give your yeast plenty of time. As I mentioned, the butter that you've added and perhaps also the sugar are restricting the yeast access to the things they need, the flour and the water, to help them produce that gas, that carbon dioxide that will rise your loaf. And so give them time to do that process. It might just take a little bit longer in an enriched dough. Tip number 4 would be about chilling your dough before you shape it. Now, when you make an enriched dough, when you add in things like butter, eggs, sugar, all of these things contribute not only to a beautiful, light, delicate bread at the end of your bake, but during making, they can actually make your dough quite sticky and quite wet, especially once you've kneaded in lots of butter if you're making something like a brioche. Once it's risen, you can pop it into the fridge for 30 minutes just to chill and to firm up a little bit, and it will really help you when you're shaping your dough and help you bring your dough together into a great shape so that it will rise and bake well. My last tip will be about baking your enriched dough. Once you've added in things like fats and eggs, but especially sugar, all of those contribute to a slightly sweeter and enriched dough, but that will also mean that your bread will brown quite quickly in a hot oven as it bakes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's baked all the way through. It will probably go a dark brown colour on the outside, even if it's not finished baking. So there's two things that can help you there. First of all, enriched doughs are likely baked at lower temperatures, so about 200 degrees centigrade, even in a fan oven. Still fairly warm, but lower than you would do if you were just doing a plain bread without any of these enrichments. Also, if your bread is getting really brown in the oven, you can put a layer of foil over the loaf at the end of the bake to stop it getting too dark whilst you finish it baking all the way through. If you've enjoyed these tips, then you can subscribe to my bread making newsletter with lots more tips, recipes and more. You can find the link to subscribe below this video. I hope that's been useful in helping you bake an enriched dough if that's something you're thinking about doing. Let me know how you get on. I'd love to see your finished bakes. Otherwise, I'll say bye for now and speak soon.